Welcome back to WHDT World News. We're going to run down the list of the top underreported news stories of 2013 with the director of Project Censored, Mickey Huff, right now. Mickey, number 15, food riots, the new normal. What is that story about? Why was it underreported?
Well, this was a story also that came out in The Guardian. Nafis Mossadegh Ahmed. Nafis actually did the foreword in our 2013 book and wrote a lot about climate issues. This story in particular talks about, because of issues related to climate change, we are likely going to see food shortages, serious problems in terms of people having access to foods. And this is something that's going to it's going to cause major conflicts. It might cause wars. And Nafis talks in his article about crop yield drops of possibly upwards of 40%. There's just a lot of serious issues surrounding the climate change, where we can measure some things that have been happening in terms of the pattern of change. We know that there are some individuals and groups that say that climate change is some kind of liberal hoax, or they like to associate it with people like Al Gore, so they attack people like Gore. And we're not really interested in that. What we're really interested in is what does the data suggest about climate change, and what are the human impacts and then the economic impacts of that. I mean, if you take a look at even the U.S. Department of Energy and the Pentagon are doing, hardly groups that one would refer to as radical in terms of understanding climate problem and so forth. They're both preparing for major changes in climate. In fact, the Pentagon and the RAND Corporation not long ago really put climate change as one of the top security risks for nations in the 21st century. So
certainly there's a debate about climate change that's raging across the planet right now. But why was this story, why did it come in at 15 as opposed to 14 or 16?
The ranking of these stories, I think, is relatively arbitrary. We have a series of national judges that are journalists and scholars and so forth that have been with us over the years. Some of our judges have been people like Noam Chomsky or Howard Zinn and other people. But what we do is we work with professors and students all across the U.S. This recent book, we had 18 colleges participate, over 50 professors, a couple of hundred students. We looked at several hundred stories. And ultimately, what happens in this process is there's a validated independent news process where the story is researched by students, vetted by faculty that are expert in the field, that look for validity of the story, the factual nature of the story, and also LexisNexis ProQuest searches for where has the story been covered, and also where it has not been covered.
Sounds like a pretty complicated algorithm, and you've definitely got it down. Coming in at number 14, everyone's got a cell phone, iPads, and all this wireless technology everywhere. Number 14 came in, wireless technology, a looming health crisis. Tell us about that story.
Well, we've covered this for the last couple of years. This story comes from Global Research. There are a number of people that have been writing about this. It's something that you haven't heard a lot about if you live in the United States. Part of that reason is telecom lobby has tons of money. Cell phones were sold as safety devices, items of convenience. It's sort of like the new tether, right? We don't need to chip people to follow them around anymore. That people willingly carry around their GPS locators so they can be found at any time. Which one could argue that saved your life, but it also allows the government to collect a lot of data.
Well, they certainly are, as we've discovered with the NSA revelations.
Absolutely. But the health issue is this separate issue that's associated, and that is that if you take a look at some studies that have been done across Europe, there are some real red flags coming up about electromagnetic radio frequencies, how people hold these things on their heads, wear them on their bodies. There have been reports of people that have brain tumors that are shaped like, phones where people held their heads, breast cancer in women that keep their phones in their
I've heard that story about the brain tumors shaped like cell phones. Is that a fact? I mean, is that just an internet hoax rumor?
Well, it doesn't come out looking like a cell phone, but the point is that these tumors have developed on sides of people's heads where they use the phone the most. And it is also been traced to lowering for fertility in males if people wear these devices in their pockets. Again, if you take a look at scientific experts who have been studying electromagnetic radiation, there's no doubt that it's not a great thing. And if you want further proof that it, quote unquote, might be a problem, just read the small print on your cell phone. It tells you that it's not safe to put it right next to your head.
So you mentioned that this information is widely known throughout Europe, but instead in America it is underreported. You cited that it was telecom companies. Could you explain that?
Well, there's a lot of reasons that we would rather not have cell phones further regulated if we were stockholders in major companies. Take a look at cigarettes. Back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, cigarettes were good for you. They were okay. They were no big deal. Doctors advertised them and so forth, even though they were sitting on mountains of evidence that suggested otherwise, meaning the industry. Say ditto with asbestos. Insurance companies and asbestos and industries that used asbestos knew as early as the 1940s and 50s that it was a carcinogen. They sat on that material, and now they're paying for it in a lot of tort lawsuits, liability concerns. Same with cigarette companies.
I don't want to go too far into this topic. We have still a couple more headlines to hit, but do you think we'll see that in the future with cellular phone companies?
I'm afraid in the next 10 years, we'll be able to get more significant long-term data about the problems that are related to habitual cell phone use, chronic exposure to Wi-Fi technologies. I mean, again, we're not talking about paranoid fantasy here. We're talking about studying a problem scientifically and finding out what the serious drawbacks are. We know from history that blind sort of adoption of technology has oft led to various catastrophes and disasters. We don't think electromagnetic radiation should be treated any differently. And we really urge people to use the cautionary principle. Like, rather than assuming it's safe, assume that it may not be safe, and try to use your devices responsibly.
Now, shifting to number 13, the headline for that is "A Fifth of Americans Go Hungry." Explain.
Mike Ludwig at Truth Out did a story on this. There are many other stories on hunger that we've seen over the years. And this is something that's coming in through here, the end part of the year 2013. This is something that we see Congress maybe cutting even further, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. What we see in this country is we see somewhere close to 500,000 households really running short on money for food. And children actually are really suffering a great deal. 1/5 of American children live in poverty. So what we're dealing with is food insecurity in the United States, a country that, again, boasts massive wealth and opportunity. But as the economy has really slid backward for many people, for most Americans, that's come out. It's come out in homelessness. It's coming out in hunger issues. Homeless shelters and shelters that feed people are really overtaxed and are running out of resources. And in fact, a number of municipalities in the U.S., including most recently Los Angeles, are passing provisions that it makes it illegal to feed homeless people in public. So not only are we having a developing problem with increased number of people in poverty and going hungry and an overtaxed system to try to assist people in those problems, we have a sluggish economy that it is not giving people a lot of opportunity for jobs that pay enough to survive. And on top of that, we have some major cities in the U.S. making it illegal to help people. That's something that one might suggest is more criminal. And we think people have a right to know that information.
Coming in number 12 is the U.S. has left Iraq with an epidemic of cancers and birth defects. That's a shocking headline. Yes,
it's definitely a shocking headline. Reported again in The Guardian and The Independent in Great Britain. Democracy Now! Did some coverage on this. And we've covered this story before, actually, not specific to, say, Iraq, but what we do know now after 10 years of occupation in Iraq, that we have left behind a wake of radioactive materials. We have really sullied the environment. There were reports of white phosphorus being used. There have been conflicting reports, but the more we've researched it, the more we believe that there is the use of depleted uranium going on in places like Iraq that leads to not only health problems for people living in Iraq, but also American troops that are there and contractors that are there. This type of radiation and this kind of environmental contamination doesn't choose its victims. It will affect anyone who is in the environment. A few years ago, one of our top stories was how the Pentagon was, in fact, the largest single polluter on the planet. From huge burn pits in Afghanistan to, now we see, cancer epidemics breaking out in Iraq. We really have to think about what is the cost of empire, fiscal costs, human costs. We've done stories on how many casualties there have been in Iraq, and this is just another one of those very tragic stories.
So why do you suppose that this story was underreported? With something to do with its connection to the military-industrial complex and the benefits, if you will, that the military contractors get by selling the depleted uranium. Is that a reason?
I would suggest that's one reason. Another big reason is that this story has human fingerprints all over it. This is a story about people being extraordinarily adversely affected by an occupation and violated international law and a war that was based on false pretenses, where over 800 false statements were made by the Bush administration on this run up to the war in Iraq. And this is a consequence of that. And people that some people don't even believe we're still there. And now we're still in Afghanistan, and maybe in Afghanistan past 2024. These are the costs of war, and they affect people. And they are not just affecting people in the area who are living there. They affect Americans, just like we're seeing here not long ago, where people aboard the USS Ronald Reagan, who went over to try to help with the Fukushima disaster, have contracted thyroid and cancer and leukemia cancer. Again, these problems will affect anybody in the region, whether it's done by natural disaster or the irresponsible use of nuclear energy, or whether it's warfare and imperialism. We use the world as our garbage dump for these toxic materials. We think people need to know about it.
You mentioning nuclear weapons brings us to number 11. Bush blocked the Iran nuclear deal. What are the details behind that?
Well, basically, this goes back. And some people say, well, why are you still dealing with stories in the Bush administration? Well, because some of those stories and some of the decisions that were made actually affect us now. There were a few opportunities in the Bush years to work with Iran and negotiate different uses of nuclear energy or nuclear materials and so forth that could have put us on a somewhat more stable footing in the Middle East concerning various relationships with nation states and people. And the Bush administration decided not to do that. And the neoconservatives in the Bush administration tended to have pretty hard lines on various issues, whether it was Paul Bremer's work in occupied Iraq, or whether it's unilateral support of Israel vis-a-vis Palestine. And again with Iran, you see a lot more saber rattling with Iran and policies that push Iran more into a corner. If you take a look at the countries that we're occupying and where we're building our military bases in the Middle East, guess what? They surround the country of Iran. So Iran has every reason to believe that the United States has ulterior motives and interests. We're also, of course, building bases there to keep more check on China. So it's not just about Iran. But the United States has been smarting because of Iran since the 1979 blowback revolution stemming from the CIA coup in 1953. This is a long-standing story of really a lack of honest diplomatic efforts by administrations in the United States to really try to grip with what does it mean to have a nuclear Iran in the Middle East? By the way, no one ever wants to talk about the already existing nuclear power in the Middle East meaning nuclear weapons power in the Middle East, and that would be the state of Israel.
All right. That was the director of Project Censored, Mickey Huff. Tune in tomorrow for part 2 of our interview as we continue the countdown all the way to number 1. Stay tuned. We still have the rest of today's headlines, all of the news from Hollywood, California, and a full report on the weather right here on WHDT.